Welcome to Unedited, our fortnightly podcast where we explore the opportunities and challenges that the retail industry is facing. From fashion, beauty and homeware, myself, Grace Hill, will be chatting to leading experts in the industry to shed light on how retailers can create a brighter future. So we're currently in a time where there is polarization globally on what consumers can and cannot do, whether they're in the height of, sadly, another lockdown or opening back up as we are here in the UK. The only constant is change. Therefore, today we wanted to share insights from different parts of the world that are at different stages of their COVID journey, Australia and Poland. But firstly, Australia, a market which has been open longer than any other country. We wanted to share insights from this market to help equip retailers globally as they plan and prepare for life post-COVID. This region is unique in giving the world insight into how consumers are dressing post-pandemic without restrictions. On today's podcast, we have Kayla Marci, Market Analyst here at Edited. Welcome back to Unedited, Kayla. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast today. How is life down in, well, maybe not so sunny Melbourne at the moment? How's it going?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's been surprising. Today has been such a beautiful day. So there's still really, really great weather. I feel like I'm just constantly rubbing it in. We're allowed to go out to restaurants, go outdoors, and we also have beautiful weather.
Oh my God, what more could you ask for? Literally living the dream. No wonder you left London.
Yeah, the weather was a big decider for me.
Yeah, I don't blame you. So firstly, Kels, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about you and like your role at Edited?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the market analyst for Edited. So I sit on our analyst team, and I believe that you had some recent guests on the analyst team on the podcast a few weeks ago as well. So I work with the lovely ladies such as Venetia and Avery. But I also work on the marketing team. So basically my role is to translate the data we have into the reports that our customers use, but also send it out into the world and ensure that some of the big publications like Business of Fashion, Vogue Business, Wall Street Journal, and so on are seeing what Edited is doing.
Amazing. I know you've created some incredible insights that many of you will have seen out there in the press and in our insider briefing and blogs that you all have access to. But besides the kind of latest snap lockdowns across a few states in Australia, the country has kind of essentially been COVID free for a while now. And for context for all of our listeners, Kayla is one of the few Aussies who works at Edited and was actually visiting Melbourne right before coronavirus hit. She got stuck there, but I don't think she was too unhappy about that. Eventually came back to London for a few months, but as she just mentioned, the weather was a real deciding factor in her moving back to her homeland. But with your global perspective, Kayla, could you explain the situation in Australia compared to what's happening in the rest of the world?
Sure. So I'm currently based in Melbourne. And as I mentioned, things are pretty much back to normal. And that was a huge shock for me coming out of my 2-week quarantine that I could actually go into a restaurant, inside of a restaurant and eat. Which I don't believe you guys have had the luxury yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. But yeah, it was amazing to see, we're all attending weddings. We are able to go into shopping centers maskless. Currently the only place we are required to wear a mask is on public transport, which is pretty fantastic. But as a global perspective, Australia really hasn't had as many cases as the US and the UK. We've had under about 30,000 to date. Yet in some areas such as Victoria, where I'm based, there have been some pretty dramatic steps taken in order to get to this point. Just before I left a year ago to return to the UK, I actually just missed out on Melbourne's over 100-day lockdown. So that was, pretty good timing on my behalf. And as you can imagine, that has been so challenging for retailers. However, looking back now, it certainly has paid off, because while we can't travel internationally, we are operating as normal as possible. And then retail from that has bounced back. And I think that has just put Australia in such an interesting position, especially from the perspective of Northern Hemisphere retailers. You have parts in Europe where consumers are still living under these strict lockdowns, and they haven't been able to return to their normal way of life. Or you have in the UK, things are slowly opening up. And I think that has really flipped the script. Australia has always been a season behind the Northern Hemisphere. So, coming from working in retail in Australia, we always look to the US, the UK, Europe for trend inspiration. And now with these harsh lockdowns, retailers are looking to Australia to see how we're navigating this new normal and what consumers are really wearing and buying post-lockdown.
I guess that's what's so interesting, right? Yeah. That you have the opportunity with data and insights into different geographical regions who are at completely different stages in their coronavirus cycle to understand what is happening, how are consumers responding, how is that impacting retail, to be able to get those insights to kind of influence and take action within your own business, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just really curious to know as well, Kayla. Obviously, you mentioned you can go into shopping centres maskless. I know in the UK, obviously, we're still having to wear masks on public transport and in any internal, inside space. Have you found that consumers are still wanting to wear masks, or is everyone seeming to be pretty happy? Does the majority seem to be kind of maskless and enjoying kind of living, their life and shopping as if we'd never had that coronavirus period of having to wear a mask?
Yeah, absolutely. I think generally you'll find in all regions around the world, you'll have the people who are very resistant to wear masks, and Australia is no exception. So I think it was quite a relief when the masks could come off. At the moment, they're only allowed on public transport. The only place you would wear them is on public transport, but you still see people who aren't wearing them. So I definitely think it was a huge relief for Australian consumers, and definitely something that helped drive Australian retail to where it is at the moment, because it is in a really good recovery position. We're seeing consumer confidence is surging. There's been a boost in employment, and according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, March sales for clothing and footwear and personal accessories have risen. It's up 1.4% month on month, and then turnover 2.3% year on year.
Wow, that's really exciting to see that sector kind of returning to growth and positive numbers.
Positive growth, nice to see always.
Exactly. And the other thing that I have to ask is, how was a 2-week lockdown in a hotel? Because you're one of those people that has had, the pleasure of experiencing that.
Yeah, so that was quite hard. I'm very happy that I had my work to keep me occupied. So of course I was still working for Edited while I was over. There was no way I was taking leave while I'm stuck in a hotel for 2 weeks. What I didn't realize was how strict they were on alcohol consumption. So my partner sent me about, 6 or a dozen bottles of wine to my hotel room for me to enjoy over quarantine, but I was only allowed to have one a day. So they tried to ration me out.
So they were just kind of drip feeding you these bottles of wine.
Yep. So every day I had to call and be like, oh, I'm ready for my next bottle now. Please send it up.
Room service, literally.
yeah, pretty much. So I was very lucky to have that, and constant testing. I was tested every 5 days or so. So it was, it was very hard, but I understand, why it needs to be done. But I was very glad it was over. And especially coming from London, I couldn't believe that as soon as I could leave, I could go straight into a pub and indoors of the pub. And
wow.
Yeah, it was just so
quite bizarre.
So foreign. And even then I was still quite, quite, I was masking up, and I was worried about getting too close to people because I was just so used to being in the UK where you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
I also had to show a negative test to get on the plane. So in the lead up to it, I was being so careful. But just over here, you just don't have to be.
Wow, I can't wait for that moment. That will be very...
It's coming, Grace, it's coming.
So you've already mentioned, obviously, that the Southern Hemisphere has usually played catch up in terms of seasons. And I know that you have that unique experience of where you worked in buying yourself in Australia, but have also had the experience of working in the UK and in the Northern Hemisphere and having that perspective. How have retailers historically analysed Australia as a region, and how has that now changed?
Yeah, I think there has been a whole complete transformation with the processes between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. I mean, traditionally, being that season behind, Aussie retailers had a bit more of a luxury where they could watch their aspirational markets for trend inspiration, like the UK, and then they would have that 6 to 18 months or so to interpret what they learnt from maybe a buying trip, and then develop that into the more successful trends. But we know that processes obviously don't work that way anymore, and they haven't. We have social media and online shopping. Consumers can easily see what's trending on the other side of the world, and they want it now, they want it yesterday. If we were to stick to these traditional processes, by the time these hottest trends got to Australia, it's missed the window. Consumers are on to the next biggest thing. Mm-hmm. So that was a really big shift, especially for Australian retailers selling to Australian consumers, trying to stay relevant against these international retailers who were shipping to Australia and starting to steal some of that market share. But then on the other side of the coin, we've seen over the years just so many international brands just recognize the opportunity that there is in the Australian market. There was a huge influx at one stage of the Zaras, the Uniqlos, the Topshops, H&Ms all opening up, and it was complete chaos. We had like lines around the street to get into a H&M, like pre-pandemic. Could you imagine a line to get into a H&M? But that was what it was, because we never had this. And I don't want to show my age, but I worked at, I think, the second Zara store to open up in Australia, and we were constantly just being stripped of our inventory. Like, people were just taking everything. It was madness. It was so new to them. But that doesn't mean that just because it's international that all brands can succeed in the Australian market. I think long before the Arcadia brands were separated over in the UK this year, we had, ASOS and Boohoo buy up those brands. Before all that, Topshop had closed its Australian stores, and it wasn't as much of a success as its other fast fashion competitors. So I really think the international retailers who have managed to make it work aren't offering Australians a completely different collection as to what they can see online and what they can see on social media. Of course, it does need to have some nuances, but not so completely different that we can kind of clock if it's, what didn't work for the UK summer, that they're just giving it to Australia.
Yeah, shift all their dead stock that didn't.
All their dead stock, don't give it to us. Yeah. I think a really great example is, the Zara dress of 2019. It feels like a lifetime ago now.
Oh my God, the infamous polka dot dress that you'd see like 7 people on the same tube wearing.
It was like playing bingo. You could just go. Yeah, I remember my mum visiting from Australia, and I was telling her about this dress, and we went to Paddington Station, and she was tapping me like, it's the dress. So in Australia, that dress actually arrived first in black with white polka dots, and then about a month later, it came in the white one that we all know. And I think this was a really interesting and quite a clever move, especially, being a Melburnian, our style is synonymous with wearing all black. So I think that was really something that was quite clever to do, giving us the same products, but slightly switching it up so it resonates in our market. There's this big conception that Australia, we're all beach and desert. And, as we were saying before, I live in Melbourne, but we had a beautiful sunny day today, whereas a few weeks ago it was raining, and we're notorious for having 4 seasons in one day. So I think something that brick and mortar retailers selling to these different states really need to understand the climate, so they're allocating the right stock to the right store.
I think that's a really important point to note. I think, like, even though I've been lucky enough to visit Australia, my gran is Australian, it still boggles my brain that actually, you know, it isn't all super hot, 30 plus degrees and sunny in all parts of Australia all at the same time, and that actually Melbourne's climate is very different to that of Perth or, you know, the kind of Gold Coast, for example. So I think it's really important that retailers are cognizant of that, and they don't just, it's not just an entire one size fits all, because Australia is a huge country with varying climates.
For sure. And yeah, it's a blanket assortment isn't really going to cut it with the Australian consumer. And, you know, that was something that we learned when I used to work in footwear buying and product development for an Australian company. And we would have, when we were delivering our boots for the fall winter season, we would still be ensuring that our Queensland stores were well stocked up with sandals, because they get to the same kind of climates as our Melbourne or our Sydney stores. And then you have, you know, if you're, you know, working in kids wear and school wear, you want to make sure that you're promoting hats all year round, because as some Australians might know, we have this saying, no hat, no play. It means you can't go outside and play unless you've got a hat on.
Oh my God, I love that. So Kaylas, from your, you know, unique experience and insight, you mentioned obviously that Topshop actually closed its Australian stores before the events of the past year, with Arcadia going into administration and selling off its different brands. Why do you feel like that brand struggled and ended up closing its stores in that region?
Yeah, I mean, the time that it entered the Australian market, it was a time when we had just Zara, we had H&M coming, you know, and not to mention that Australia already has its own set of, you know, low priced, trend driven brands. So I think, again, it was up against a lot of competition, and maybe for similar reasons, it didn't work in the UK. It really needed to have some point of differentiation against that. So, you know, the same reason that it is struggling and why the Oxford Street store closed is could have been maybe foreshadowed by its closure within the Myer stores in Australia, within the Chapel Street stores.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was its just eventual demise. But it is, you know, the Australian market is very crowded. There was the stage when, as I mentioned, all the international designers were coming, international brands were coming in all at once. And then already from that, we have a very, you know, stable selection of brands already. We have the Country Roads of the world, the brands that are sitting under the Just Group. So we already have our own, you know, versions of that brand. So.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, because I actually had a conversation in the past couple of weeks with an ex-Arcadia employee who actually managed the Australian stores, and she spoke about how she would have a constant battle being the middleman between the insights that the Australian stores were sharing with her, you know, being on the ground, what's selling, what isn't, and then having to communicate that back to head office in London, and actually trying to kind of demonstrate that they couldn't send the exact product that was in the Topshop store to those stores, because the customer needs a different type of product. It needs, you know, almost like exclusives that are relevant to that market, based on seasonality and consumer preference as well. And, you know, she had to use a lot of data to back up the fact that it was actually going to be a commercially viable model for them to do so. So maybe that's an interesting part of why that brand struggled in that market. But I know we've obviously, a lot of Northern Hemisphere brands have really been looking to Australia and the Southern Hemisphere in, you know, the past year. What do you think we've learned from this market, and are there any big categories or trends that have trickled out of Australia that countries like the US and the UK have adapted or could adapt moving forward as we go into our spring summer season?
For sure. I mean, as I mentioned, we already have a very established selection of big, I guess, big box retailers, you could call them. And then also these, this amazing talent of local designers who are really focusing on craftsmanship and building their own unique identity. But I guess in terms of fast fashion trends, it's always been interpreted from the Northern Hemisphere, but I think what's really interesting is we're starting to see over the past few years this new wave of kind of cool girl brands that are born from Southern Hemisphere and born from Australia, and they're starting to influence these, the fast fashion behemoths on the other side of the pond. A few years ago, it was all about the realization par Alexandra dress. You remember? I do have one. The ruffle, the little stars that everybody was wearing. Madison Beer, Kylie Jenner was wearing it, and then the cheetah print skirt. I think it was called the Naomi skirt. And then now it's the with Jean, the Andy dress, that's the long sleeved ruching, really, really short, that we're starting to see interpretations from Pretty Little Thing and Shein. So whereas traditionally before Australia was viewed as a market for opportunity and international brands could expand into it, it's definitely becoming more part of the conversation and influencing global trends. And given that it has been relatively COVID-free for some months, Northern Hemispheres can really get some pretty solid insights into examining what's working and where retail is going. I'm sure it's a question on a lot of retailers' minds, what's happening with loungewear, what's happening with party wear. So this is an example of a region that has been, COVID-free, and they've been able to pick up kind of the pieces of their lives and enjoy the freedoms that we used to take for granted.
Yeah, like that's such an amazing point, right? Like you guys have been able to go to weddings for, a decent amount of time at this point. And also to know, I think you told me this the other day, with no cap on numbers, right? So
there might be, but I think it's quite loose, like it's in the hundreds. So it's you could have a decent wedding,
A pretty substantial wedding with over 100 people at least.
I mean, I'm not sure of the exact numbers. I'm not planning a wedding anytime soon.
Maybe your partner can hear you chatting about it. It's very entertaining. But I do feel like for especially UK and US brands, obviously we have wedding season coming up, and I know that a lot of friends who work in retail, who work on dresses categories specifically, it's that constant conversation of what do people want to wear? What are people going to be wearing for occasions? And Australia is the perfect market to study, right? Like, as you said, with Instagram and kind of consumer trends, the appetite is kind of globalized, and help dictate your future assortments and what you come back with confidence.
Sure.
I guess.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so interesting. And I think, you mentioned on the last podcast with Venetia and Avery talking about loungewear has become more of a staple. Like it's not going anywhere, but it's not seeing tremendous growth. And Australia, we've definitely seen this as well. So we're still seeing interest. Loungewear and sleepwear, we saw new sellouts this year, from the start of this year, up 12% year on year. And then activewear, of course, continues to go from strength to strength. It's up 6% year on year. So it's not huge numbers, but it's still showing that there is some interest and that the trend isn't going away anytime soon. They've almost reached like an evergreen status. They're now as part of your wardrobe as skinny jeans once were. They've reached that kind of pinnacle. But where there is growth is in these categories that were neglected over 2020. So denim, for example, full price sellouts across men's and women's wear increased 65% in Australia year on year. So, denim suppliers are looking forward to a much more fruitful year if Australia is anything to go by. And I know that we've seen a lot of patchwork and a lot of more relaxed styles in the UK and US as well. As you mentioned, party wear is seeing a rebound. Sellouts in Australia surged 198% year on year, and then heels 183%. So that's all indicative of a complete swing away from the dreaded C word, as in comfort, into party wear, but of course comfort will still be embedded in everyday lives. And what I also think is another interesting area is swimwear. Last year it was kind of a bit of a problem child with vacation cancelled. Now if we look at Australia over their summer, which runs December, February, new sellouts saw an increase of 113%. And so that's something we can perhaps expect to be reflected within markets such as the UK, especially as we just announced that you can travel to Spain on your COVID passport if you present a negative test or proof of vaccination.
Yeah, it's a challenging year because a lot of retailers are going into this spring summer season relatively blind because they don't have last year's sales or last year's performance to back up their decision making and their seasonal planning, because the typical summer categories were kind of flipped on their head. No one was buying swim, no one was buying dresses, so they don't have that history to fall back on and help them understand what consumers are gravitating towards. And I know Australia has always had that swimwear kind of mecca status, in the sense that like that is the market to really focus on, to understand what are the kind of upcoming trends within that category.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And even it's kind of struggling, it's kind of challenging because that data is so skewed. So you kind of don't know what to look at. Like if you look at 2019 data, so much has changed since then. So it is, I understand that retailers would be struggling as to where to look, which is why it's so great when you have tools like Edited that can give you that global market view, and you can kind of gain insight into these regions that have, in some sense overcome COVID and are moving forward.
Totally. And as one of the most talked about topics from the pandemic was how the fashion calendar has kind of had the unique opportunity to reset itself, since the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere are now flipped, and we're seeing Southern Hemisphere actually ahead of us in terms of trend and calendar. Have we seen that actually happen?
Yeah, I think it was a huge topic of conversation, especially within luxury brands, but it has kind of sort of fizzled out. Last year, we saw brands like Dries Van Noten and Gucci trying to inspire systemic change to rewire the fashion calendar. So products would land closer to season and really optimize selling times, and then eradicate the need for the constant discounts or huge discount events like Black Friday, just have promotions twice a year to clear out what was left. And then this would protect their margins and minimize dead stock. But, from a luxury standpoint, there really hasn't been that many shifts. Though shows are now mainly digital, the runway is still pretty much going ahead as per usual. We're just missing a couple of big names from the regular circuit who are showing off calendar. We recently had Gucci's Aria collection, which was fantastic. That little anatomical heart-shaped bag was just amazing. And then Burberry as well with their femininity collection off the traditional calendar. But the fashion industry's processes have been in place for so long, so it would really take more than a year, more than 24 months to actually see some change. And I kind of think, from an environmental perspective, where a rewire really needs to happen is not within luxury, but within fast fashion. That would, of course, take some serious coordination from brands to all align their product drops and discounting patterns, which, of course, we haven't been seeing at all. When COVID first broke out, the fast fashion industry did have its much needed slowdown, but now it's more or less back to normal with constant product drops. So, I really don't see much of a change at all in terms of all this talk we had at the start of last year about resetting the fashion calendar for the greater good.
Yeah, I think sadly as well for many retailers, right, that they're trying to survive, commercially and doing what they know best, which is delivering as much trend as quickly as possible and as much as possible, sadly. So, and I think there's also that scary stat, which I was again just reminding myself of yesterday, is that kind of the global fashion apparel industry contributes 10% of all global carbon emissions, which is quite staggering, really, to think this one industry has such an impact. But even though many and most of the fashion shows were cancelled in the past year, or they were postponed, or they were moved to a digital format, we saw some really exciting and innovative initiatives and methods. We were told that the industry could reduce its huge carbon footprint, but apparently, actually, traveling for buying trips and fashion weeks hasn't actually had a huge positive impact on the environment either. And, we knowing Gen Z's conscious mindset, how do you think the Aussie Gen Zs will react to this?
Yeah, I think that's what's been quite a shock. We were all kind of hoping something good would come out of COVID, especially for the environment, with production slowing down in serious carbon emitting countries, beaches aren't as crowded, we're not traveling as much. However, in the grand scheme of things, there really hasn't been that much of an impact. I was actually really quite shocked to discover that the World Meteorological Organization said the effect of lockdowns on CO2 in the atmosphere was so small that it is just registered as a blip. So it's, definitely not a time for retailers or consumers to be complacent and think that COVID has managed to, buy them some time or stall negative environmental impacts, because as you said, it really hasn't. I think mentioning the Aussie Gen Z is really interesting. There was this McKinsey study that revealed out of all of the APAC regions, Australia was the only one where Gen Zers said that they'd pay more for sustainable goods. And it was a greater proportion than compared to other generations. So it was 39% of Gen Z versus 28% of millennials, and then 16% of Gen Xers. So here we have a consumer group that is actually dedicated to change and willing to pay more for it, which has always kind of been it's kind of been
the struggle, hasn't it, for retailers? How do you price that assortment?
Absolutely, and it's always been kind of the struggle, with Gen Z as well, because they're kind of given their status as the generation that's going to change everything, but they're still buying fast fashion hauls. They're still, adding to this problem, but they're the ones who are the face and the front of climate change.
But I think it's encouraging, though, that it's sad that there aren't actually more regions within APAC where that demographic would pay more, but the fact that within Australia that is something that is a worthy cause that's worth paying for. But it would be good to get your understanding as to why do you think, what are the factors that have contributed to this, and do you think that there's a link between the Gen Zs willing to pay more and potentially the climate impact that we've seen in the region with bushfire season, for example?
Oh, I think bushfires is certainly a contributing factor. I mean, growing up in Australia, it's a common occurrence, and it's one that you kind of, it's always going on, but just the one that occurred at the end of 2019 and led into 2020, combined with how the Australian government handled it, with our Prime Minister going on holidays to Hawaii while the country's burning, I think that really accelerated the urgency of the climate crisis for Australians of all ages, but particularly the Gen Zs. They're the ones who have to live with it. They're the ones who are fighting for their future. Despite this, I would say that Australia is shockingly behind in terms of sustainability efforts, especially for such a wealthy and developed country, because it's usually the more, wealthy countries who are able to implement change through, the infrastructure. But there still are a lot of funds that are going into capturing and storage of emissions from fossil fuels. And then at the recent climate summit, it was very clear that Australia isn't as ambitious with their climate goals compared to other countries like the US. Australia announced that by 2030, its aim was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% in comparison to 2005 levels. And that's actually about half the size of what Biden proposed to do in the US. They're aiming for about 50 to 52%. And so I think it all kind of comes down to the very conservative, maybe a bit bumbling leadership that we do have in this country.
Right. Well, we understand your political views from those comments, Kayles. And I think I can speak for many of us who are surprised by countries like the US and the UK who've done actually a phenomenal job in widely distributing the vaccine. However, from reading the news, it's been reported that Australia's vaccine rollout has been slower than most. With the BBC reporting it's fallen short of its goal. Do you think that Australia's vaccination efforts could impact its place right now as the current go-to fashion market?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, while Australian retail is in a great place, it could all see a backward slide due to its sluggish position in the vaccine race. The climate is just so volatile. It's been 1 year on from the initial outbreak, but we're still seeing regions in their third lockdown. You just don't really know what's going to happen. In Australia, while it's managed to avoid a third lockdown, sometimes the winter, if that's the pattern that we're seeing is sometimes the winter hits harder. So, there's no guarantee, and it really makes it all the more important for global retailers to be monitoring the markets that are doing well, that aren't doing as well, and then really reacting while they can.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's the thing. It could so quickly change, right? As we've seen. Yeah. With the virus.
Yeah. And even in Australia, when we had just a snap lockdown because of, there was one case and, one person was detected with COVID in Perth. And because they moved around the city, suddenly it was all locked down again. So you just really don't know what's going to happen. And it kind of puts us in a strange position that we can't quite fight it as we're not as vaccinated as the rest of the world. So it is a bit worrying.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think fingers crossed, your government that you think so highly of, hopefully they can get those vaccines rolled out ASAP.
No, maybe it wasn't a good idea to leave the UK after all.
You'd be coming up soon for your vaccine, Kayles.
Exactly.
So we've discussed Australia in depth, and I wanted to switch gears now and discuss a place that has maybe had less mainstream coverage, but it's becoming a very important market to look at. And a number of our customers at Edited are extremely interested in this region and this country in particular. And also, I have to say, you have a very interesting experience in the sense that you are half Polish and you've spent a lot of time living in that region as well. So I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about Australia and Poland, or kind of Central and Eastern Europe, I guess. But could you firstly educate our audience on the Polish consumer profile?
Yes, definitely. Two regions after my own heart here, Grace. I think, why so many consumers are interested in Poland is it's, a region that's certainly showing a lot of promise. It's poised to be the EU's most resilient economy in terms of COVID recovery. And the economy is expected to grow 3% by the end of 2021. And that'll make it the only EU member to return to pre-pandemic levels. This is, of course, all pending the impact of Europe's third wave. In terms of the consumer, they are more traditional. Digital transactions and online shopping are on the rise, but there is still more of a preference for shopping in store. They're also very price sensitive, and I think that's quite a common attribute among Eastern European consumers. Statista reported 73% of Poles expect value for money from their fashion purchases, and this is a value that they place higher than buying the hottest trends or products with a low environmental impacts. And then you have on top of that, 1/3 of Poles noted a drop in income during the pandemic, so that'll make them even more conscious about price. edited data can really back this up, this price sensitivity, by, analyzing the products selling out in the mass market in Poland versus a region like the UK. We're seeing the categories that are experiencing the highest sellout are more likely to house those entry-level, more purse-friendly price points, such as your accessories or hosiery, as seeing a greater proportion of sellouts than in a region like the UK. And then if you dive in deeper to that, the majority of, sunglasses, for example, that sold out in the UK, we saw the advertised price point was between 15 to 20 pounds. So I've got to think what currency I'm in at the moment, since I'm across so many regions. 15 to 20 pounds was the price point, whereas in Poland, the sweet spot is under 15 pounds, which kind of translates to about 78 Polish zloty. So it's really understandable that retailers are finding there's such a market of interest right now, but also especially their consumers. A traditional consumer who only wants to, or mainly wants to shop in store, kind of gives insight into an older consumer. However, there are many, younger customers who would have left Poland in order to travel or find work with better wages. They're starting to all come home due to, Brexit or, COVID. And then there's that Gen Z consumer who's restricted from travel. So there is an opportunity for these local and international brands to really create a narrative with the younger consumer as well.
Absolutely. I feel like that's really interesting insight, that you've kind of almost got this combination and this melting pot of different profiles and tastes and preferences rising. And LPP is one of Eastern Europe's biggest retail groups, and according to its deputy chief executive, he did an interview and said, Eastern markets are different. Customers prefer traditional ways of shopping, so we will simply open more stores there, which is an interesting comment, considering the boom of e-commerce and everything that everyone in retail has been discussing in previous years. Firstly, what countries are even defined as Central and Eastern Europe? Kayla, I know we've gone back and forth on this.
Yeah, I feel like you'd be better to answer this, Grace. You're a geograph. I can't even say the word. You're a geography buff, whereas I'm not. So, I was preparing for an article, and I literally was Googling what is Eastern Europe countries, because there are so many different results. I know if you talk to some Polish people, they will say very firmly that they are Central Europe, not Eastern Europe. However, different search results might give you, different things. Britannica and Wikipedia certainly define countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary as Central Europe. And then, Russia, Romania, Greece, Georgia, Belarus, Armenia are actually Eastern Europe. But then you have, UN Statistics Division, put Poland in Eastern Europe, and a lot of travel websites as well. So to keep it simple, for an article that I was writing, we use this term Central and Eastern European countries, which is CEECs. So that's kind of a bit more all-encompassing for countries that covers Central Europe, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe, and the Balkans. So usually a lot of former communist states. So that was how we defined it, but there are certainly different ways that you can cut it, and a lot of it does depend on geography, and some of it depends on religion too.
Absolutely. And why do kind of Central or Eastern European consumers, or in particular Polish consumers, prefer traditional ways of shopping, as per the LPP's deputy chief exec's comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we said, it's very traditional, and it really is that in every sense of the word, as from someone who has spent some time there. It's super conservative, very religious. It has about an 87% Roman Catholic population. And I think that's, it's a super high number. And I think that was really brought to the attention of the world on social media, with the women's marches this year and last year, the Strajk Kobiet. So a region that would seem to be very set in its ways would be more, kind of reluctant to change, I feel, but I don't think it's going to be that way forever. I mean, there are a lot of signs that are indicating that these Central and Eastern European countries are adapting and evolving to online shopping, just maybe at a slower rate than what we're used to.
And how do you think kind of COVID will have impacted that? in the sense that they too have experienced lockdowns and non-essential retail having to shut its doors.
Yeah, I found this really interesting. There was a study by PwC and said over the course of the pandemic, 33% of Poles mainly shopped online for footwear, accessories and clothing and so on, while 43% shopped in stores. So even despite a pandemic, you still have consumers prioritizing in-store over online. But I also think what is really quite interesting is, as I said before, I don't think this will stay the same way forever. And there have been some notable shifts, despite, this fondness for traditional methods of shopping and the drop in wages. A third of Poles are actually shopping online more than previously.
Right.
And if you look at other Central Eastern European countries like the Czech Republic, they're ranked as some of the most frequent and avid shoppers. And you have 80% of internet users purchasing goods and services online. And that puts them ahead of other, their neighbors like Hungary, where it's 70%, and Slovakia, 68%. And then other regions, you have Bulgaria, Romania, they have less than 50% of internet users shopping online. However, these markets have seen the largest increase over the past 5 years. So as I mentioned, it has been a reluctant shift. It's definitely starting to evolve. So, retailers who are tapping into this market, the omni-channel approach is really the best way to go, because we can start to see this shift towards e-commerce, but they are still a preference for in-store. So covering all bases is definitely the savviest thing to do. And, a great example is Zalando. They added Poland to its Connect Retail program. So that allows local brick and mortar businesses to sync their stock and then sell that via Zalando's online platform. So really getting the best of both worlds there.
Very clever. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that it's that, that we're seeing the growth of e-commerce, but potentially that was out of necessity, and that the preference is still with traditional. And it's actually, as you said, the omni-channel approach is the way to go, and that Zalando is somebody to be looking to as to how they're navigating that market. In the same Reuters article that the LPP chief exec made the comments, they mentioned the LPP's push to open more stores comes after big Western brands are shutting down their stores actually in Eastern and Central Europe, after kind of originally flocking there to the region in kind of the year 2000 to take advantage of rising incomes and fast economic growth. Why is it that these big Western brands are shrinking their presence?
Yeah, I think, COVID is definitely a factor there. We've seen brick and mortar retailers all around the world be impacted as they were forced to permanently close stores, even after lockdowns lifted, as the operating costs for maintaining a store that no one has gone into for 6 to 12 months is just simply too high. But even before COVID, brands were evolving on their e-commerce strategies and leaning more in favor of e-commerce, as you said, due to convenience. Yeah. So we've just seen that accelerate. And, I think in the last podcast, Venetia made an excellent point that stores today need to have a purpose. They need to have some sort of excitement for consumers, and we'll see these big brands shuttering stores in smaller regions of the world, or their smaller stores, to really concentrate on e-commerce, or reinventing their flagship, so there's something that consumers will want to visit even after the novelty of going back into store post-lockdown has kind of dissolved. So I think it's this has created an opportunity for local brands, such as the LPP group, to really cater to their consumers, but also for new entrants who may want to test the water in these emerging European regions without having that pressure of your big H&M and your Zara, etc.
Absolutely. I think that's, really interesting and insightful advice. So we know, and again, some of our listeners might be surprised to know this, maybe not being as familiar with the region, that face masks were already a staple accessory for the Polish consumer. So did Poland kickstart pandemic dressing before the pandemic even happened?
No, but not quite, I guess. But yeah, face masks in Poland have dated to pre-pandemic times as an essential in retailers' assortment, it has shockingly high smog levels. 33 out of the 50 most polluted cities are in Poland.
Wow.
And it has some of the worst air quality in Europe. And this is because it's a poor country. A lot of homes don't have the adequate heating, so they burn low quality fuels like wood or sometimes even rubbish just to stay warm. And then you have, the country has a huge reliance on the coal industry, and that emits this kind of dusty smog that's really quite prominent even in, the more developed cities like such as of which, to be honest, I'm an asthmatic, and I didn't quite notice that much until I left Poland, and then I could constantly smell it in my hair. And it's something that you'll see in winter. People everywhere will be wearing these anti-dust and anti-pollution masks. However, it is a year-round problem, and the smog is just as bad during the summer days as it is in the winter. But I really love pandemic dressing before the pandemic in Central Eastern European countries. Something that I found super interesting is if we move focus to Ukraine. At a conference with Vogue I attended to, in the pre-pandemic days when you could travel, I noticed, I know it feels like a lifetime ago, I noticed a lot of women wearing the pajama dressing trend and really championing that there at this conference. And was very oversized shirts, wide leg pants of this really luxurious silky fabrics. And one of the women who was based in Kiev had this beautiful buttery neutral set. And I instantly asked her where it was from and Googled it because I wanted to embody that look. And, it's from a brand called 12 Stories, which is a Russian brand, if anybody is interested, on some lovely pajama dress. And, this was like 2019. So there was this big 90s nostalgic rush, and, everything was denim and a bit grungy. That kind of trend had kicked off. And, she said to me that nostalgic look wasn't really popular in Ukraine, as they associate denim very much with Russians, where it was synonymous, denim was synonymous with their youth culture, especially heritage American brands like Levi's, which were very hard to come by and almost a sign of rebellion among young people during the Soviet Union. So, due to the political conflicts between Russia and the Ukraine that are still going on today, she said denim and this kind of nostalgic way of dressing, this 90s or Y2K dressing, wasn't as revered in Ukraine as it would be in other countries. So it's really interesting. You have many things influencing fashion, outside of, the Kardashians or outside of supermodels. You have, things like the pandemic, and then you have your environmental influences and geopolitical factors as well.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You just, when you're sat in your home country, you kind of, we know how important denim as a category is in the Western world, and you can make assumptions about consumer preferences in different regions, and it just shows the geopolitical, as you said, influence and cultural influence it can have on fashion trends. So it's very important to know your market and understand that consumer in depth. So for retailers looking to enter this market, what are some of the categories that are performing well that new entrants can really take advantage of?
Yeah, I think in terms of like trends associated with a lot of Central Eastern European countries, there's this kind of automatic association of this post-Soviet style of dressing that was really popular. You remember back in the Vudemont's heyday, when there were designers like Gosha Rubchinsky really entering the mainstream. Again, that very 90s nostalgic, the matching tracksuit sets, streetwear with Cyrillic slogans, the high-low style of mixing sportswear and luxury. This aesthetic still kind of crops up with Gen Z today, but there are many more Central Eastern European designers that are finding mainstream success. You've got Anton Belinsky, Shylak, which is a Polish leather goods brand that make beautiful leather accessories and handbags, and Kutasaka, Nanushka. And these designers are kind of evolving this post-Soviet look to become almost the post-Soviet look, that still has these streetwear roots, but includes elements of refinement and avant-garde and sustainability. So it's kind of taking it beyond the working class Gopnik subculture, it's called, which has now almost become a meme and a stereotype associated with these regions. So almost like the Eastern European equivalent of a Chaz, to put it in UK terms. But in Poland, sports and activewear definitely stand out as a key category, especially within the Gen Z market. This demographic, they're spending on sporting products and services saw a 40% increase last year. And then looking at edited, we could see sneakers as the top selling item for women in this area, while for men it's performance tops. And then, we could see, despite the lockdown that they had over Easter, there wasn't really that return to your pandemic dressing of loungewear. Blouses equaled 27% of tops selling out in Poland, while hoodies and sweatshirts were less than 3%. And then dresses were the second top moving category in this market, with summer floral styles seeing success. So that kind of taps into that dopamine dressing phenomenon that we've mentioned before. So it is, like you mentioned, a whole melting pot of trends. So having this kind of data to understand what consumers are buying is definitely advantageous.
Absolutely. I think on the kind of dopamine dressing point as well, I know you and I were going back and forth over Reserved's recent campaign around kind of designed by Gen Z Poland, and they've created this like very 90s noughties kind of like website that is the lookbook for the collection. And there was this bright yellow ruffled top and trouser set, which really spoke to that look and that trend, which I could see you in, Kaylas. I could see that very well.
I love that, and I just thought that was something really cool to do, because Gen Zs are the ultimate influencers, and we see so many other regions of the world. French fashion, very influential. You have your Scandi style that's well known around the world. So I just really love that kind of spoke to what is Polish style.
Totally. And Kels, we always ask our guests this question, and you're not going to be any different. So what is the one thing you would love our listeners to take away from this episode?
Definitely arm yourself with data when tapping into any new region. Again, the great thing about Edited is you have the opportunity to do so. You can understand where there are gaps in the market, where there's opportunities in your products and your pricing and so on, because really entering new turf is easier said than done. Retailers definitely need to educate themselves on geopolitical climates, currency complexities, cultural differences, really get to grips with the appropriate times to run sales events, for example, and avoid any cultural faux pas. Back on Australia, January 26th is a highly controversial date. It's called Australia Day, but it marks the British colonisation. So it's actually a day of mourning for our First Nation citizens. So, retailers really shouldn't be capitalising on this date to promote their half-price sales. So, definitely having an understanding of that region and then the data to back up your decisions.
I love that final comment. And I think it's absolutely true, right? I think the conversation we've had today very much demonstrate there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach to your kind of geographical expansion and international strategy. So, Kayla, thank you so much for coming on today. Really enjoyed that topic and
my pleasure.
Interesting.
Wow. My pleasure. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. As a listener of ours, we're here to support you throughout 2021. If you're a customer of Edited, please contact your dedicated account manager and retail strategist, and they'll do everything that they can to support you. For all our listeners, ensure you're subscribed to our insider briefing. Sign up at edited.com, where we'll be keeping you all updated on the latest news and strategies. If you've enjoyed today's conversation with Kayla, Please make sure you subscribe to keep in the loop with all of our future episodes, and we'd love it if you could tell your friends or family about us. And if you have any further questions, you can get in touch at unedited@edited.com or tweet us at edited_HQ. Goodbye.